Yeah.
Okay, well, this is interesting. So first of all, thank you very much to Subaru, who has been a very kind neighbor today as Gemini is dealing with a cybersecurity attack at Gemini North and Gemini South, and all our systems are down. Subaru was kind enough to host us over here. So very, very nice of them. We very much appreciate that. It feels a little bit weird to introduce Ben to a room of people that actually know Ben, but I will do so anyways. Ben Forrest is a postdoc working with myself and others at University of California, Davis on the C3VO survey. This is charting cluster construction with Woods and ORL, so acronyms within acronyms within acronyms. Ben got his bachelor's degree at the State University of New Jersey with Dr. Andrew Baker. He went on to Texas A&M. There's a nice connection between Aggie connection between Texas A&M and UC Davis, working with Kim Vitran. So he got his master's PhD there. He then went on to UC Riverside to work with Jillian Wilson on the magazine survey, which he is, I would say, de facto PI at this point. So this is looking at quiescent-ish galaxies, very massive at higher redshifts, natural synergy between that and protoclusters at high redshift. So the magazine survey and the C3VO team have teamed up, and Ben's going to talk about some of those results today. The stage is yours.
Great, thank you, Brian. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and everyone who's attending online. And as Brian said, thank you very much to Subaru for hosting us today. Yeah, it's great to be here. And I was thinking about, I think this is the first in-person, like kind of seminar style talk I've given in several years. So hopefully it goes somewhat smoothly. Yes, as Brian said, so I'm working mostly at UC Davis on the C3VO survey, and I'm also doing some work on site with the magazine collaboration, and I will be talking about both of those in the context of the talk today, massive structures and massive galaxies at redshifts greater than 3. I'll be discussing how we identify candidates for both these types of objects, how we then spectroscopically confirm them, and what it all means for life on our little planet, I guess. So without further ado, I'll just say also, if you have any questions, feel free to ask at any time. I don't mind being interrupted. There are slide numbers if you want to remember them, if you have a question based on a plot or something like that, just at the bottom, or not, it's all good, whatever. So, all right, let's dive on in. Basic outline, I'll start with talking about massive structures and the C3VO survey. And then that will hopefully tie in very smoothly with the discussion of massive galaxies before wrapping up at the end with some conclusions. But yes, so massive structures. Right? In the local universe, we have these very massive galaxy clusters. These have halo masses greater than usually around 10 to the 14 solar masses is what's given as the canonical number. And these are homes to actually the most massive galaxies that we know of, these brightest clustered galaxies. And the galaxies in these very dense environments are distinctly different from galaxies that are not in these dense environments. We see that they have older ages, they have redder colors, they have different morphologies, they're different in many different ways. And there are a few processes that are responsible for this, mostly known, some of them perhaps unknown as well. One of these being ram pressure stripping, where a galaxy traveling through the intercluster medium actually gets its gas, which would otherwise be used for star formation, removed, thereby preventing further star formation. So this is a figure from a review paper from last year by Stacy Alberts and Allison Noble, just showing this effect where as you go from left to right, you are getting into denser and denser environments. And this is showing that the fraction of galaxies which are forming stars decreases as you get into these denser and denser environments, with split there by stellar mass, but in both cases you see the same trend, just with an offset. And so this is from Redshift 0 data. Again, these cluster galaxies are more evolved, or just galaxies in denser environments are more evolved than their co-equal field galaxies. And these trends are seen not just at redshift 0, but even at earlier times in the universe. So if we go back to, for instance, redshift about 1, this is from Adam Tomczak's work with the Or Else survey, which Brian may have alluded to as one of the many arrangements of letters that we often use to name our surveys. And so this is showing what's called the stellar mass function, where on the x-axis we have the stellar mass of galaxies, and the y-axis is just the number density of these galaxies. And here it's plotted as a function of environmental density, with blue being the least dense environments, and pink, red, magenta being the most dense environments. And so we can see as we transition from lower to higher density environments, there is a change in the shape of this stellar mass function. Notably, there are more high mass galaxies relative to low mass galaxies. And there's also a normalization offset, which we expect with the change in density. But this suggests that, again, there is this evolution of galaxies where in these dense environments, they are preferentially more massive and more evolved than their field counterparts. So that's redshift 1. As you go further back in time, around redshifts 1.5 to 2, we start seeing some mixed results. There are some studies that see differences between field galaxies and cluster members, but there are also some studies that show there's very little difference in certain properties. So these are 2 of those cherry-picked studies showing the comparison between cluster and field galaxies and their star formation rates as a function of stellar mass. And the takeaway here is essentially that the different colored points are pretty much the same. The top plot, the black circles and the blue stars, which are the cluster and field galaxies respectively, are pretty much the same population. And on the bottom, the red circles and blue stars are similarly fairly same distribution. So this is contrast again from what is seen at lower redshifts. And so it seems as we go further and further back in time, the apparent effects of this environmental evolutionary change are less apparent. And that makes sense in some cases. We go back to earlier and earlier times, these cluster environments are rare or even don't exist at all. These overdense environments that some galaxies exist in are not virialized. They don't have the intracluster medium that, for instance, allows for ram pressure stripping to occur. And so in some sense, we expect there to be fewer effects. But this does raise a question, which is, okay, if we see galaxies which in clusters today are more massive and are older, well, at some point they had to form that mass in their history when the field galaxies did not. And if we're seeing cluster and field galaxies being the same, that doesn't answer when that happened. Presumably it happened at some point earlier when cluster galaxies were forming more mass or somehow accumulated a greater stellar population in order to later have these larger masses. All right, and yeah, so these are essentially those questions. What is happening at these earlier epochs, right? Before we have these clusters in these so-called proto-cluster environments, what is happening with galaxies therein, even going to smaller overdensities, which we call galaxy groups? Are there effects on galaxy evolution in those environments at earlier times? And as I alluded to, when do these eventual cluster galaxies form the excess stars that we observe them to have relative to field galaxies? And so introducing the first of several acronyms, and actually let me hide this for the people in the room here. Cannot see my mouse, but I think that worked. Okay, maybe not. All right, well, charting cluster construction with VUDs and or else, or C3BO, which I think most people in the room know that already. And so this is the survey that we're working on at UC Davis. And I guess to break it down a little bit, VUDs is a spectroscopic survey, the VMOS Ultra Deep survey, I'm saying VMOS on the VLT. And or else was the precursor survey, which looked at clusters at about redshift 1. And so this, the goal of this survey is to identify and spectroscopically follow up and characterize these overdense protocluster systems at redshifts 2 and above, mainly by first identifying them using a statistical combination of photometric and spectroscopic data, and then doing detailed follow-up with Keck Deimos and Keck Mossfire predominantly. And so this will enable us to characterize the galaxies in these structures and also disentangle any effects on galaxy evolution that these environments may have. All right, and so as far as the data involved here, C3BO is based on 3 legacy fields, legacy extragalactic fields, which have huge amounts of ancillary photometry from a variety of surveys, anywhere from the UV all the way to the near IR. And these are the Cosmos, CFH-TLS, and ECDFS fields. These were chosen because they are fields which were targeted by VUDs originally to have large numbers of spectroscopic redshifts. And so since there is all this ancillary photometry, there are these very wide-ranging multi-wavelength photometric catalogs in these fields. And importantly, for these higher redshifts that we're discussing, these catalogs have fairly deep near-infrared photometry, which is critical for identifying things at higher redshifts, where a lot of the light from high stellar mass objects is transferred into the near-infrared. And as I said as well, the VUD survey in particular has large amounts of spectroscopy. That's what the pink squares here are on each of these images. That's the pointings from the VUD survey. And so this kind of gives you an outline of the footprint of the survey. And again, there are many other surveys that have taken spectroscopy as well as made photometric catalogs and identified candidate overdensities in all of these fields. All right, so how do we go about identifying these candidate structures? So this is taken from one of the Orell's papers, which kind of first used this method, which is the Voronoi-Monte Carlo map method, or BMC method. And so the construction of this involves taking your photometric surveys combined with spectroscopy as well, and just splitting these galaxies into very thin slices in redshift, and then doing a Voronoi tessellation on this slice. And so Voronoi tessellation is where you essentially take each galaxy and you draw the median bisector between it and its nearest neighbor in any direction. And so any line that you see on that leftmost plot is halfway between one galaxy and another. And as you can then infer, the smaller the size of that cell, the higher the density of the environment of the galaxy which resides in the cell. And so this process is then repeated many times with random draws from the photometric redshift probability distributions of different galaxies, and then averaged and transformed into a cell system, as you can see in the middle panel there, where it is colored by the overdensity of the environment. And so the overdensity is essentially taking the density, or which is related to the size of these cells, and then taking that normalized to the median in some redshift slice. And so that gives you the density of a region relative to the average density at that redshift. And so then on the right, you see a plot for one of the clusters in the Orell survey, where redder is again the most overdense regions in this cluster, and blue is underdense and more related to the field. And so using this method, we can identify regions and galaxies in particular that are ideal for spectroscopic follow-up, and therefore enable us to increase the number of member galaxies that we have in these structures, as well as characterize the spatial distribution and extent of these different structures. So here are 5 of the main structures, I guess I would say, that we have been following up with Keck primarily. And so just kind of going through them each. On the top left is the Hyperion protosupercluster, redshift about 2.5 in the Cosmos field. And so this is an incredibly massive, a few times 10 to 15 total mass system that was published in Pucciati et al. 2018. And then we have on the top right a system at redshift 4.5 in Cosmos as well, which is one of the highest redshift protoclusters with this number of spectroscopic members in it. This was first published in Brian Mo's work in 2018 and is currently being worked on by Preeti Saab, one of our graduate students at UC Davis. In the middle, we have a redshift 3.3 structure in CFHT-LS. This was published again in Brian Mo's work in 2014, as well as Liu Shen's work in 2021. Which characterize the members and the different AGN activity that's going on in members in that structure. In the bottom left, there's a structure redshift 3.5 in the ECDFS field. This is something that I looked at a little bit in some of my previous work in graduate school with the Z-Forge survey, where we found an overdensity of emission line galaxies in this region. And that is something that Ekta Shah, one of our postdocs, is working on currently. And then on the bottom right is a structure redshift 3.3 in the Cosmos field, which I'll be kind of discussing a little bit more in detail here, which has been found independently by both C3VO and the magazine survey. All right, so we've nicknamed this structure Elantari, which is the name for the Queen of the Stars. And that's simply because the structure is quite large and has a large number of stars being formed in it. But a little bit of background about this structure. This is just a projection map where each of these colored regions represents an area that is at least 2 sigma overdense relative to the field. And each of the white ellipses, of which there are 10, represents a region that is at least 5 sigma overdense relative to the field. So these are extremely overdense regions at pretty early epochs in the universe. And so I mentioned this was identified independently by 2 different surveys. And so the magazine survey identified 2 ultramassive galaxies, one at about the P1 location there, and the other one at the P7 location, which are at about redshift 3.35. And had numerous spectroscopically confirmed neighbors. And then independently, C3VO identified a candidate overdensity at around P2 down here. And you can see this dashed line. That is the footprint of the VUT survey, which, as I mentioned, has a lot of the spectroscopic data that we use. And so that maybe prevented identification of the further extent of the structure to where it was identified in the magazine. But we had these 3 systems which had been followed up and had large numbers of species at around redshift 3.3. And so we decided to investigate the surrounding field and see if there were any connections between the systems. And this is how we identified these further overdensity peaks as well. So we do have time this coming semester on Keck to do further spectroscopic follow-up, but already we have over 100 species between all of these systems, which if you are not familiar with high redshift protoclusters, that's maybe an order of magnitude more than a lot of protocluster discoveries have. So it's pretty well characterized and pretty well mapped out at this point, but more data is always good. We've also done some modeling of the system, trying to model when it will collapse and virialize. That's a typo, because Keynote does not like the word virialization. Instead, I corrected to virtualization. So most of these peaks will virialize and collapse by around redshift 1.5 to 2. And the system as a whole will probably not all collapse together, at least by redshift 0. Who knows what will happen in the future. But some of these other structures, for instance, S2, S3, and S6, they are close enough together that they could gravitationally collapse into a single gravitational well by redshift of about 1. We can also model the total mass of the system, which comes out to about 1.5 times 10 to the 15 solar masses, and that's the redshift 0 equivalent mass. And so that will, when this system collapses, will then make it a full-blown cluster with a strong X-ray detection, presumably at the center as well. All right, so going back to the stellar mass function, again, on the left, this is the picture at redshift 1 in clusters, where again, I showed that we see with greater overdensities, we see a preference towards a large number of massive galaxies. And so on the right is a similar plot for Elementary, where we have bin things again by overdensity. And so the gray here is the field curve, and we can see as we go to increasing density bins in cyan, magenta, and green, that the shape of the stellar mass function again appears to change, this time again with a preference towards a larger number of high mass galaxies. You'll note that the difference is not quite as significant as at redshift 1, which of course makes sense. There's been less time for these systems to evolve under the influence of these overdense environments. And this can be seen when we take the ratio of the stellar mass functions to the field stellar mass function, which is shown here. So on the left, again, these are the stellar mass functions at redshift 1 in different density bins relative to the field. And I've overlaid there in green, magenta, and cyan lines, which are roughly representative of the locations of these curves on the right at redshift 3.3. And so again, what we're seeing is that as you increase the density in these systems, you are increasing the ratio of high mass galaxies to low mass galaxies relative to the field. And what's interesting is that the curves that we see in Elementary here, so the green, magenta, and cyan, the overdensities that they correspond to are roughly in line with where they lie on the redshift 1 systems. So it is, if you have the same density, same overdensity, it seems to result in the same stellar mass function. It's just that at redshift 3.3, you don't have the same extreme levels of overdensity that you do in lower redshift clusters. So that is what creates the difference between the plots. And so if we now back up and kind of take a look at the picture as a whole, not just at an individual structure, we can see that as a function of overdensity, there is a trend with star formation. There's a trend of star formation rate with overdensity. Whereas you go to higher overdensities to the right, you do see an increase in the star formation rate for galaxies. And that is slightly dependent on stellar mass. And there's a large amount of scatter, but this is, again, over a huge range of environments, not just clusters and field, but also presumably protoclusters, groups, and potentially even voids as you go down to the very left side of this plot. And so at these higher redshifts, right, there are fewer quiescent galaxies as opposed to at redshift 0, where we see larger numbers of quiescent galaxies in clusters. Here we see fewer quiescent galaxies in protoclusters. And in fact, what we're seeing is that this is where there is an increase in star formation rate for these cluster members. So these epochs around redshift 2 to 5 is potentially when eventual cluster galaxies are forming their excess of stars relative to field galaxies. All right. And so kind of the main takeaways at this point from C3BO survey, and just from this brief little piece of it that I've given you a snippet of, I will also say that there will be talks in the coming weeks with more details on various aspects of the C3BO survey. And for those of you who are in Hawaii, you can always ask Brian Lamo if you want more information about C3BO as well. So yes, identification of these massive structures is possible without targeted spectroscopic follow-up. So I need to emphasize targeted there. If you try and perform these experiments with photometry alone, it seems you cannot do this. You cannot find these overdense structures at high redshift. They do not stand out enough with photometry alone. You really need spectroscopy to figure out exactly where the systems are. And then once you have identified candidates, you can then do spectroscopic follow-up in a targeted manner to really characterize what galaxies are members of these structures and try and disentangle some of these effects of environment on their evolution. So I will take a brief intermission and ask if there are any questions at this point. I think a lot of people in the room are familiar with this. I don't know if anyone on Zoom has questions. Yes. Oh.
Nice. This first half of the talk.
Thank you.
Do you have any clue of how much you're basically basing your selection of like UV brightish objects?
Mm.
If you have something that is not self-forming but is there, how much you contaminate your intuition, what's happening there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. At these redshifts, we don't expect there to be systems that are completely made up of quiescent objects. If there were, those would be very difficult to detect using this method if there's not already spectroscopy of those members. That being said, if you do have a large number of star-forming members in a protocluster and some quiescent members, you could identify the structure just from the star-forming members. And then when you're doing the targeted spectroscopic follow-up, you could identify the quiescent objects as well. And so, yeah, to really characterize the structures, the targeted spectroscopic follow-up is important to do.
Fuck.
Someone's unmuted, I think. Is there a question?
I don't think there's a question.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah. All right. All right. So I will now move on into discussing not massive structures, but massive galaxies. And as I said, there is some, and I guess as Brian alluded to in the introduction, there is some relation between the two. So in the local universe, as I said at the beginning, galaxy clusters are home to the most massive galaxies known. And these are these brightest cluster galaxies, or BCGs. And these are early type ellipticals. They have no ongoing star formation. They're extremely red. They're just evolving passively as the cluster exists around them. When there are studies of spectroscopy is done of the cores of these very massive galaxies, what is found is that the stellar populations are extremely old. And so this is a plot taken from Thomas's work in 2005 and 2010, just kind of showing as a function of look-back time where galaxies of particular stellar masses on average form. Right? So if you have a galaxy that today is 10 to the 12 solar masses, modeling suggests that it formed most of that stellar mass 12 billion years ago. Whereas if you have a galaxy that today is 10 to the 10.5 solar masses, modeling suggests there's a much larger spread and when those stars formed, but around 7 billion years ago, it was kind of the average of that. And then of course, as you get into lower redshifts and more recently, you can have other effects start to play a role. You can have things like rejuvenation play a role where star formation starts up again. You can get environmentally driven effects with mergers and interactions that can trigger additional star formation. I mentioned that it's when looking at the cores of these massive galaxies, it turns out the stars on the outskirts are not quite as old as the stars in the core. And that is likely due to merging effects. And so understanding when the cores of these very massive galaxies in the local universe formed is an interesting question. It's also particularly important, again, in the context of the stellar mass function. Right? So this is, again, the plot of the stellar mass function here at somewhat higher redshift. And on this plot, the purple points, purple circles, are observational data, and the lines are from various simulations. Right? And so what you can see here is that there is a pretty strong discrepancy at the high mass end between these two. It can be a factor of 2 to 10 times, depending on, exactly which observations and simulations you're looking at. But this is found with various data sets. Right? And so the question of whether these most massive galaxies exist at these very early times is something that's important to understand for our models of galaxy evolution. All right, so this is kind of the similar plot showing the stellar mass function as a function of redshift from the recent Cosmos 2020 catalogs, where the purple at the top is the stellar mass function at about redshift 0.3, and going all the way down to the yellow at the bottom, it's at about redshift of 7. And one of the interesting things to note is that if you go up to the highest mass galaxies, around just under 10 to the 12, a lot of these lines overlap. And so the suggestion there is that these very massive galaxies formed at very early times, and their number densities haven't really changed, i.e. they've just kind of stayed there. They all formed, and then they all just passively evolved through cosmic time. And so that is perhaps consistent with what we see for the course of these massive galaxies being extremely old. But it does raise some very interesting questions about, if this is true, why did these galaxies form very few stars in the last 12 billion years? It's not entirely clear. So in order to kind of attack these questions, which include, as I mentioned, do these galaxies exist at early times? And if they do exist, are they no longer forming stars? Are they quenched? And then, do the number densities that we see in photometric surveys, can we actually believe them, or are they wrong for some reason? And then what environments do these objects exist in? Are these already in these protocluster environments, which will evolve into clusters, and these massive galaxies evolve into these BCGs? Or is there something else going on where they eventually fall into an overdense environment? It's perhaps unclear. And one of the reasons this is unclear is that very few of these things have been spectroscopically confirmed this early on. And as I mentioned when talking about the catalogs for C3VO, a reason for this is that the very deep near-IR photometry, which is so critical to identifying these objects, really hasn't come about until the last decade, or I hate to say 2 decades and date myself, but at least the last decade has really become a lot more powerful. And that's a combination of not just Spitzer, 3.6 to 8 micron observations, but also Y, J, H, and K band observations around 1 to 2 microns. All right, and so, the survey that, as Brian mentioned, I'm part of, based out of UC Riverside, is the Massive Ancient Galaxies at Redshifts Greater Than 3 Near Infrared Survey, or magazine. So no acronyms within the acronym, but it's a pretty lengthy acronym on its own. So there you go. And so the goal of this survey was to look at these massive galaxies at redshifts greater than 3 and try to spectroscopically confirm them. Up to this point, galaxies with stellar masses greater than 10 to the 11 solar masses at redshifts greater than 3, there were literally single digits that had been spectroscopically confirmed. And so this was our goal, was to drastically increase that number. And so the photometric catalogs that we used to select these sources were in some very familiar looking fields. The Cosmos field, which is also in C3VO, and the XMM LSS field, which has some overlap with the CFHT-LS field in C3VO as well. So 2 of those 3 fields, there's some overlap. And again, the photometry here is very critical to identifying candidates accurately. And so in the case of the Cosmos field, when you include all these medium band surveys, there are up to 50 band passes from 0.3 to 8 microns for a single galaxy. And so that allows you to have very high quality photometric redshifts and have very good SED fitting to estimate the properties of these galaxies from photometry alone. And so here I'm showing 3 of those SEDs from Gemini Marchand's work in 2022. We kind of have 3 different types of galaxies, if you will, here. A post-starburst galaxy or recently quenched galaxy up top, a UV currently star-forming galaxy in the middle, very blue, and then a dusty star-forming galaxy with a 24-micron detection indicating potentially some AGN activity on the bottom. And you can see all these have photometric redshifts of 3 or above, and stellar masses of 10 to the 11 or above. And so there were a large number of these candidates, which we then were following up with Keck Mossfire. And we were quite successful, a bit more successful than we had expected. In the end, we published a paper a couple of years ago with 16 of these UMGs spectroscopically confirmed, which again is the largest sample to date. And not only did we find spectroscopic confirmation via very strong rust frame optical emission lines, H beta and O3, as you would see in a star-forming galaxy or potentially an AGN-dominated galaxy. But we were also able to confirm galaxies via their Balmer absorption features. So these are these post-starburst galaxies, which are no longer forming stars and have not formed stars for the last few 100 million years. And so this was a bit unexpected to find these quiescent galaxies at these early times. These had only been found, I think, 1 or 2 times previously. Right. And so the suggestion here, again, answering the question from before, is that we confirm without a doubt that yes, these massive galaxies exist at these very early times, but we also find that some of them are in fact quiescent. They are no longer forming stars, and unless there are mergers or something else happens, presumably they would have fairly similar stellar masses down to the present day. And so here I'm showing the distribution of these ultramassive galaxies on the left in UVJ space. For those of you not familiar with this plot, this is a rust frame color diagram, the idea of which is to separate galaxies which are currently forming stars from galaxies which are not forming stars above in the wedge. And so again, we did find a large number of these galaxies which are no longer forming stars, not just by this classification, but also if you look at their star formation rates on the right compared to the stellar masses. Many of these galaxies have star formation rates up to 2 decks below the star forming main sequence at these epochs. So they are definitively not forming stars and are below the average for what you would expect at these early times. All right, so now we have the question of 2 questions. Where did these things come from and where are they going? Right, and so for those galaxies where we have Balmer absorption features, these features are very sensitive age detectors of age or measurers of age. And so we can actually do fairly accurate modeling of the star formation histories for these objects. And so this is one such object. This is XMM 1120. Which is one of the more massive galaxies at redshift 3.5, which is no longer forming stars. And what we see here on the panel, the blue dots, these are some of these very high redshift dusty star forming galaxies. These are things which have star formation rates of thousands of solar masses per year as derived from their infrared luminosities, infrared detections. And roughly speaking, and we're going to be at this point, it seems that the star formation histories of these objects are consistent with the mass growth of these DSFGs. And so that suggests that there is a phase of massive galaxy evolution where they are initially these dusty star-bursting galaxies, and then something causes them to quench their star formation and become more passive. As far as where are they going, if we look at the sizes of these UMGs, they're very, very, very compact, right? Not as compact as like a quasar or something, but they're pretty small. And so in order for them to become these BCGs, these most massive galaxies that we see at lower redshifts, they do need to grow in stellar mass a little bit, but actually they really need to grow in their physical size a fair amount. And so this is where something like mergers come into play. And so on this little kind of toy model here, what we show is in green are some of these massive BCGs at low redshift. And then the cyan line represents kind of where these UMGs are. And so you can see that in order to really grow the size by a factor of a few, you need a large number of minor mergers, which will increase the size without increasing the stellar mass too much to the point where they become more massive than anything we see in the local universe. And so you ask, well, where are mergers likely to happen? Well, they're more likely to happen in overdense environments. And so one would then perhaps expect that these ultramassive galaxies lie in these overdense environments. And in fact, that is what we see in some cases anyway. So of these 16 UMGs we have, 4 are in spectroscopically confirmed overdensities. Again, some of these have been discovered both by C3VO and by Magazine independently, which is pretty cool. And the other UMGs, which are not in spectroscopically confirmed overdensities, have spectroscopically confirmed neighbors. So they may still be in overdensities. We just have not spectroscopically followed up those regions to confirm it. And I think the cool project in the future is to use these VMC maps that we have from C3VO in these fields to do an exploration of where these most massive galaxies reside. Are they preferentially in these most dense environments?
Ben, I have a question.
Yes.
So in this constraining of the star formation history is the concept that it's basically a closed box system, that none of the mass that you see in situ at the redshift of observation comes from merging activity. And as a kind of follow-up to that, the size of the galaxies, the UMGs, constraining in the sense that you can't have a lot of merging activity prior to observation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the modeling itself is a bit agnostic about where the stars form, just that they end up in the system, I guess. But yes, you're right. Looking at the sizes really can give you a key to that, or an insight into that, where if you see large amounts of disturbances or bits of fluff or non-circularized systems, then that is perhaps evidence of some sort of merger activity. Thus far, we have not seen that. However, higher resolution data would be great. And so we actually do have a JWST program to follow up through these with IFU spectroscopy, which will really give us some strong insights into whether merger activity is going on here. There was also a recent paper on the archive, which was looking at JWST data and found that quiescent galaxies at redshifts of a couple do tend to have small blue neighbors around them, indicative of these very minor mergers perhaps playing a role in their evolution. So it's an interesting idea, and better data will hopefully give us some insights into it.
Probably a nice question. How do you define minor?
That's a good question. Typically, the definition of a minor merger is a mass ratio of about 1 to 10. Some people may say 1 to 4. There's, I guess, different definitions, but a much smaller mass for the smaller system than a larger system.
And so can you cleanly actually divide major mergers from minor mergers, because you have 2 different arrows to see show their evolution, that they would have to do to get to the BCGs. But are there any cases where there are also major and minor mergers going at the same time, and do they evolve differently?
Yeah, so I guess you potentially could have a system in which there are 3 galaxies merging once. Is that kind of what you're referring to? Yeah, and you could have a variety of mass ratios between those 3 galaxies. If that were to happen, yeah, you would expect certainly to see some physical imprint of that. When you're looking at it, it would seem a very disturbed system, I think. And does that answer Your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it would be dominated by the like higher mass galaxy, or you would see effects on smaller mass galaxies that would be affected.
Yeah, so the effects are slightly different, I guess, is kind of showing here. So if you have, so here this is showing kind of the difference between more minor mergers in yellow and major mergers in red, where either way, if you have two galaxies colliding, you're going to get some disturbance, right? And that can then potentially trigger additional star formation in the case of a wet merger, where you have lots of additional gas that star formation can trigger. And in that case, you increase the stellar mass substantially. I should say these arrows are normalized to the same increase in stellar mass. If you have a single minor merger, you're not going to increase the stellar mass very much, but relative to the amount of stellar mass increase you get, you will get a much larger increase in the size of the system. There is a bit of a dependence on kind of the angles at which these two things are colliding and a few other factors, but in general, that is the theorized mechanism by which these things would be.
Sorry, but one technical question.
Mhm.
This always, I don't know. I'm always curious about this. So the effective radii for these measurements, are they circularized? Are they parameterized in some way? And if so, if you use a non-parametric measure, do you see the same thing?
So this is a toy model using very basic circularized assumptions. Yeah. So I've not looked into the details of how much varying asymmetric or axisymmetric and axisymmetric systems would be. So that is a good question, something to look at. But yeah, you can imagine a place where, depending on how things are merging, you can get very different results from just a simple circularized system at the end. Right? You can have asymmetric features in there.
So like in the case of a late stage merger where tidal torquing pushes stuff towards the center, maybe you get into the circularized, if you parameterize the size in a axisymmetric way, that you would see a bright core that would kind of dominate the radial measurement, and you wouldn't see the tidal tails manifest in that measurement. And that's why your IFU observations are going to be so exciting to me.
Yeah, and along that front as well, that something like that could be very wavelength dependent too. If you have preferential star formation in the outskirts and you look in a red band, you don't see the same, you see a much smaller size. So yeah, there's a lot of observational things that we need to hopefully will help constrain these models a bit more. But yeah, there's a lot of unknowns. Thanks. All right, so second intermission, and then I have a brief little bit at the end. But I guess we did have some questions. I don't know if there are any more moment. Okay. All right. So I've kind of presented it as, okay, we have these stellar mass functions. We see large numbers of high mass galaxies relative to what simulations predict. We also see that in overdense environments, we have larger numbers of high mass galaxies. We know that high mass galaxies do exist at these early times. Maybe this picture is all fitting together and there's some problem with simulations. But the samples that I've told you about in the context of magazine were cleverly selected such that we would hopefully confirm spectroscopic redshifts fairly easily. That is, for these blue star-forming galaxies, we would expect there to be these strong rostrum optical emission lines that we would see very easily with something like Keck Moss fire. And for these somewhat rarer post-starburst galaxies, again, there are these strong Balmer absorption features, which when you take a spectrum, as long as you're deep enough, are very clear and can give you a pretty good redshift. However, there's this empty space in the diagram here, as far as our spectroscopically confirmed galaxies. And this is where things like dusty star-forming galaxies lie. I will note you can also get some very old quiescent galaxies up here, but largely dusty star-forming galaxies lie in that region as well. And so we intentionally chose not to follow up these galaxies initially because we knew they were going to be difficult. And if you have a large amount of dust obscuration, you're not likely to get very strong emission lines. You're definitely not going to get these Balmer absorption features. And so getting a spectroscopic redshift becomes a lot more difficult. However, These things are very important to follow up, since photometric surveys predict that the fraction of galaxies which are dusty star forming, here on the right, increases as you go to higher redshift. And by redshift 3, up to 70% of these very massive galaxies are predicted to be dusty star forming galaxies. So confirming that these galaxies in this particular dimension of space are real is critical. And so with Magazine, we've been going through the trials and tribulations of volcanic eruptions and snowstorms and iced over domes to try and bring you these very critical photons. And we followed up so far 9 of these systems, showing here their SEDs, which are okay, not maybe as clear cut as some of the ones I showed earlier, but you'd say, okay, it's a redshift 3 galaxy, pretty red. There you go. But you would be wrong, and we were wrong. Because of these 9, we have 6 redshifts, and 5 of them are redshift 2 galaxies, largely very dusty, with broad emission lines potentially from AGN activity. And the one remaining one is actually above redshift 3, but it's a quasar, so it's a little less exciting for us. No offense to quasar people. So what this is saying is, okay, there are all these galaxies which we think photometrically are these high mass galaxies contributing to this high mass end of the stellar mass function, and it turns out they're not real. Now, this is still small number statistics. Maybe we need to get a few more. Please, Keck, give us more time. But the picture so far seems to be that we are photometrically overestimating the high mass end of the stellar mass function at these redshifts. The question that then comes to the front of mind is, okay, is there something wrong with the photometry, right? We're seeing that photometric surveys identify these things as very massive red objects at high redshift. Is this a result of using one SED fitting program over another? Is it the result of doing photometry one way over another? And so one of the great things about the Cosmos field is that there are a large number of photometric catalogs in the field. And so we can compare what the photometry looks like and what the derived parameters look like for the same object between different catalogs. And so what this particular plot is showing is taking the Cosmos 2020 classic catalog, which has 2 different parameterizations of every galaxy. We're taking the easy parameterization, and we're looking at UMGs in that catalog. So those are things redshifts 3 to 4, and stellar masses from 10 to the 11 to 10 to the 11.7 for this particular plot. So they all lie within the box for this catalog. Those same galaxies or objects at those same coordinates are then shown in these other parameterizations for these other catalogs on the same plot. And it's not a pure scatter plot, which is good. But you can see there is a large amount of variety with where these things are purported to be. And so, again, the suggestion here seems to be that there's just a little bit too much uncertainty when we get to these high redshift things that are very red with what their actual properties are from photometry alone. And so understanding what is real and what is not real is important. We don't know if this is the correct parameterization, if this is the correct parameterization. None of them are. Right? It probably varies from galaxy to galaxy. And so if we want to understand, how galaxies evolve in this high mass end, we really need to understand what's going on. And so, yes, question.
Are the 6 objects you already observed in this plot, or?
So of the 9 objects that we have followed up, there are 3 which are in Cosmos. Of those, 2 of them have redshifts, and those 2 are both on here. They're both selected from the DR1 catalog, and so I can't tell you offhand how many of the squares they're in for each one, but it's not all of them, and it's in most cases less than half. In both cases, less than half. So, yes, it's a little bit concerning, I would say. I will just say, looking at the photometry at the SEDs of these things, the photometry is pretty similar. The main difference seems to be, for those of you who are technically inclined, the main issue seems to be in deblending IRAC images. That's where the largest differences in flux attributed to an individual galaxy seem to lie. Terrestrial UV and optical data seem to agree pretty well between the different catalogs. Yes?
Does that mean going forward you will target based on Cosmos 2020?
It means going forward, we will probably compare between different catalogs and try and target things that are these very massive red galaxies in as many catalogs as possible.
One other technical question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, okay, so there's differences in the photometry about how you blend IRAC, which is always a concern, but when you use the same photometry, different codes, you do see an incredible amount of scatter. And so I'm wondering, do you have any idea of the genesis of that? If other peculiarities about I mean, you're really going to the extreme for these redshifts. Is it that potentially EZ doesn't have templates that can do that, or LaFar, or what's the source of that tension?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I have looked into it a bit. I have not found a singular factor. I guess the one observation I will say, and this plot doesn't perhaps show it as clearly. Well, maybe it does. So for these very red things, a lot of time for very massive galaxies in general, it's not just limited to red things. At these redshifts, often you will see a very clear Lyman break in the photometry, and sometimes you will also get a Balmer break in the photometry. If you only have a Lyman break and you can fuse that for the Balmer break, you can then get these results where the photometric redshift is put at 0.5 or something like that instead of redshift 3 point something. And so it turns out that getting the photometry around the Balmer break is incredibly important, not just as far as the accuracy of the photometry, but if you're able to get any kind of medium bands, that can really help you constrain these results. Between, in this case, the two codes, LaFar and EZ, with remaining agnostic as to which one is correct, I will say that LaFar tends to do more of the identifying objects at lower redshifts than EZ does. So LaFar will have, if we have these objects selected in one catalog, LaFar will have more of them being at redshift 1 than EZ will. Whether that's right or wrong, it's unclear. And yeah, the technical genesis for that, yeah, I don't have an answer for you at the moment. Yes.
Do you know if this scatter is limited to the red GeoGs or is that for massive galaxies?
Yeah, so it is for a lot of UMGs. Yeah, it's not just the red ones. The red ones, you do see the problems with the differences with the photometry a little bit more. If you have a very blue galaxy, there tends to be less flux in the IRAC band to then have to deblend, modulo there being neighbors nearby or something. And so for those galaxies, the IRAC photometry seems to be a little bit more similar between catalogs, whereas with the red galaxies, you can see larger differences. All right. I think that's showing that. This is then just showing the same thing in terms of the UVGA diagram, but it's a very similar picture. There's a lot of variety. Yeah, so just a couple quick conclusions. Yeah, massive galaxies, including quiescent objects, these things above 10 to the 11 solar masses, these do exist at redshift 3 and above. Definitively, we can say that there are significant numbers of them. However, that does not mean that all photometric candidates of these objects are reliable. As we saw in particular, the red objects seem to cause problems in photometric surveys. And so if we really want to understand when massive galaxies are forming or the timeline of massive galaxy formation in the early universe, really understanding the number densities of these things is very important. And so to that end, spectroscopic follow-up is almost certainly going to be necessary. I did hear from someone that perhaps doing JWST medium bands would be an interesting way to go about solving this problem. So I need to do some thinking about that, but spectroscopy would definitely do it. And so I think with that, thank you all for listening and attending, and I'll take any remaining questions. And if anyone on Zoom has questions, feel free to speak up.
So I have a question. Yeah, one in the first part and one.
Okay.
So in the first part, so you showed this ordinary density map and nicely detect normal densities. So I'm just wondering how the kind of like Spinnerman's cut or like photometric depths affect the result. Like if you don't only have the massive galaxies, probably these are kind of pointing the most massive peaks, so which sort of efficient. But if you lower the threshold, you have more dominance, and probably you the density up because of like uncertain photometric redshift and other factors. So what is
Yeah, so that's a great point. Yeah, obviously knowing what data is going into the maps is critical, and what biases you have is very important. So so we make completeness cuts in magnitude for anything going into the VMC map. So if it's below magnitude cut, we're throwing it out, and so that's kind of our completeness cut that we make. I think it's 24.8 in IRF channel 1 about. So yes, yeah, I mean, you're right. There are, very low mass galaxies that are potentially in these structures that we're not picking up. But yeah, we're willing to excise those in favor of removing contamination from other objects in the way.
Also, when you put your aspect of redshift, I think the different surveys have different selection functions. So probably, yeah, it's kind of uniform comparison is a little bit difficult.
Yeah. So that's one of the advantage with, at least in the Cosmos field, the main surveys that we're using are BUDS and Z-Cosmos and DMOS 10K. And these are, broadly speaking, wide field surveys. They're not doing targeted follow-up. And so one thing we have seen is that, yeah, if you have targeted follow-up of a particular structure, that will make it, and you feed that into the VMC map code, that will make it pop out more and be more significant. And so we want to avoid doing that a priori.
So it showed like star formation histories from the Asian K1 spectroscopy, and I think most of your object has a K1 spectroscopy, while the H-band are missing in some cases.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what is your kind of observing strategy? Why you go to the K-band first rather than going to H-band, because H-band contains more permanent.
Yeah, that's a great question. Our strategy going in was just try and get redshifts for as many of these things as we can. And so the way to do that with the least amount of time on each object before moving on was to go for very strong emission lines. So 3 and H beta, which would be in K band at these redshifts. Now, when we didn't see those, or if those were very tentative detections, we then went to H band to try and get those features that you spoke of, which we would need deeper integrations, but we would almost certainly get a redshift for those objects. Yeah, so it's not a uniform observation strategy, which has its problems, of course, but for what we were trying to do, it worked okay. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Maybe time for one more question in the room or over Zoom. Emma?
Now that GWST is doing some sort of survey, do you think you can improve a lot of your redshift setup? I mean, I think the answer is yes, but it's going to be like can you avoid to have spectroscopic redshift thanks to the additional can you avoid to have to look for spectroscopic redshift thanks to the new GWST banding in imaging? So you remove everything, all the issues that we have in iron because you resolve every single object.
So you're talking about in terms of the VMC mapping?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I don't think we've done testing on that. I am hesitant that that would help enough. I think the problem that we get with only using photometry is that the photometric redshifts are still very broad relative to the size of a cluster, right? And so if you want to pull out signal for a cluster, you either need some sort of narrowing of the P of Z's, and whether that comes through medium bands or through spectroscopy or through just having a huge number of galaxies with similar photo-Z's in a cluster. Without having that, it's going to be very difficult to do photometrically alone. But like I said, we haven't done the testing, and that could be a worthwhile test to look into.
This spectroscopy is so efficient. It's a waste
True,
of time.
that's another thing too.
Do a lot
Yeah.
of narrowband filters than do spectroscopy.
If you have, instead of being left to the brand, speeds of that, you have all the time. So
This sounds like a good conversation over coffee afterwards. So let's thank Ben again. And I'll just mention that Ben will be not here in Subaru, but at Gemini-based facility all week for people that are around on the island. And then for people that are in Oahu that are joining us, Roy Gal is one of our main collaborators for the C3BO survey. So he's over there, and we have a couple of graduate students from IFA, Manoa here, Denise Hung, and Finn Giddings that can also talk to you about C3BO. So all over the islands. Yeah. So thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.
This should be